Hi, everyone. I'm looking for my remote here. Okay, great. And I just want to say before I get started, you guys are awesome.
Yeah, you're awesome.
Totally awesome. I was totally blown away by that. Okay. I'm so happy to be here. I think about schools a lot. And as in all my various venues in and around the built environment, as an architecture critic, as a professor at design schools, as a writer, I became impressed by how hard it was for the people who design and build buildings and our landscapes to talk about what they imagined people would experience from their designs. Like how everybody, I would say, well, so what does a person look at when they come in, and where do they go, and what are the choices that you're giving them, and so on. And often it was very difficult for people to talk about that, and they'd say, oh, human experience, it's so personal. I can't really talk about that. What I can tell you about is the square footage, or the planning, or the wayfinding, or this, or that. So I thought that there's got to be more than this. And I started to write a book. And I started out by saying, I'm writing a book on human experience in the built environment. And then my husband told me I couldn't do that anymore because it was too vague and nobody knew what I was talking about. But you'll figure out what I was talking about from here. I'm going to start with this. Okay, this is a nice little cafe in the Netherlands. And basically what this talk is about is a new paradigm in our understanding of how enmeshed and thoroughly embedded in our built environments people are, to such an extent that they have a profound, profound influence on almost everything we think and do. I'll explain. It's a bold statement, but it's clearly true. So what's happened in the last 15, 25 years is that basically there have been two new fields that have come together in their understanding of human perceptual and cognitive experience. One is from psychology, and psychology has all sorts of different subsets, including environmental psychology, which I looked at a lot, ecological psychology, which is basically environmental psychology for natural environments, evolutionary psychology, sort of how humans have evolved and adapted to their environments over time, social and occupational. And it's been known that, but really only since the 70s and 80s, that environments profoundly shape the way people experience each other. Okay, so just the fact of this room being the way it is shapes your experience of me talking, of them talking, of each other, of the people across the room, and so on. It's obvious, but it's really not, or at least it needs to be thought about more. So environments, the built environment is not just of some kind of inert something. You design schools, so you know this. Basically, what you're building is what we call action settings. And I came up with the term action settings because I was reading the work of a psychologist whose name is Roger Barker, who was criticizing behavioral psychologists in the 1950s and 60s. And the reason he was criticizing them, he said, you're doing all your research in the lab. How do we know that any of this pertains to the way that people are actually experiencing environments in the real world? And so he set up the Midwest Field Research Station in Kansas, and he worked there for 30 years, and he got in a whole bunch of psychologists, and they would follow students around. And they would take notes all day long, from the time they woke up in the morning till the time they went to sleep at night. And one of the first findings that he published in the 1950s was this. He found out that you could better predict a student's behavior by looking not at who that student was, or what family he came from, or whatever, but by where he was. Okay, you could better predict what a person was going to do at any given point in the day by their setting, their action settings. Okay, so we know the possibilities for social exchange are directly linked to environmental factors. And I just show you one really dramatic example. This is by architect Jan Gehl, who's a Danish architect, who was asked to do work in Melbourne in the central business district. And you'll see from the slide on your left, I think, that basically Melbourne Central Business District was alleyways, dead, nothing going on, garbage bins outside, 5 o'clock p.m. until 8 o'clock in the morning the next day, nothing happening. And so the city hired Gehl and said, do something, please. It's dangerous, it's bad for tourism, and so on and so forth. So Gehl went in, and he is actually married to an environmental psychologist, and he said, well, you know, we can take these alleyways and we'll just like do a little bit. Like we'll change the paving so it looks nicer. We'll make a lip so that there's like a little place where someone can be close to the side of the wall, and then there's more of a walking place. We'll string lights up. We'll carve out a few places where people can have their little coffee stands and so on. And within 2 years, the Central Business District of downtown Melbourne became the most popular tourist destination in the country, and still is 24/7 activity. It's called the Melbourne Miracle. Okay, so one of my points here is, I have a lot of points, but one of them is that there are small moves that you can do. This is not necessarily more expensive, okay? I mean, stringing party lights up? Okay. Now, one of the things that I found is that we actually have a lot of data about how people experience built environments. We have a lot of data, and we're getting more and more as technology gets better, as these disciplines begin to work together, and so on. So for example, we know from social proxemics, which is a part of environmental psychology, what distances you stand in which you, like a person is engaging to me in terms of being, oh, someone interesting that I'm going to look at it about this distance, like 20 feet, 15 feet, okay? Further than that, you're just like a thing. You're an object. And, you know, closer than that, you have different levels and different hierarchies of social interaction. So as educators, obviously, and people who are designing school environments, social proxemics is really important. You want to understand that. There's also space syntax, which is a way of understanding flow at both view axes and literal walking axes for people. So, and there's whole fields. There's a there's a department of spatial syntax at London in the Bartlett School of Architecture. But a lot of designers don't really necessarily have access to this kind of information. So this is part of the reason that I do the work that I do. So another way that social environments are, that your social experience is shaped by your environmental experience. This is in Philadelphia, again by Gehl, actually. And one of the fields that he's interested in is evolutionary psychology, and one of the central precepts in evolutionary psychology is the notion of prospect and refuge. People feel safest. This is everybody, children, adults, whatever. People feel safest when they have a place that they can retreat to, that's like a little safe, that's protective, and when they can see everything that's going out and around them. It's called prospect and refuge. So you want to design environments that offer possibilities for prospect and possibilities for refuge. That's the way that people best understand and relate to environments. So Gehl, you can see, it's kind of an unprepossessing, not very promising, long axial sidewalk that he had to deal with. So what did he do? He broke it up. according to a very regular rhythm. So we like patterns. I'll get to that later. And then he gave people places for refuge where you could just sit. And it's not an accident that these blue seating containers have a canopy that actually isn't really even a canopy above it, because it makes you feel like the place is semi-enclosed. So prospect and refuge, you need hierarchies of spaces for different kinds of sociability, and you need to keep in mind that people are constantly trying to sort of navigate their way out and then back to safety, out and back to safety. Okay, so this is some of the research that's coming out of environmental psychology and all the other forms of psychology. Now, what's interesting is that this research is coming together with a body of work in what I call studies in cognition, which really originated in cognitive linguistics, believe it or not, and then was substantiated by cognitive neuroscience. All right, what is she talking about? Oh, like, why am I hearing of this? Okay, very simple. We now know that our understanding of the way people experience environments is very different from what we understood 20 or 30 years ago. It is because what they're discovering is that how we think, how we conceptualize things, and how we move through the world is profoundly shaped by the very fact that we live in bodies, that we live in bodies in the world. And because of that, now we all understand there's a mind-body relationship. We know the body is not like this independent thing and then the mind works on its own. This has all been accepted now in the last 20 or 30 years. But what this research is beginning to show us is that the mind-body relationship is only a partial representation of human experience, because a third factor is just as important, and that is the environment. It's a mind-body environment relationship. It shapes our feelings, it shapes our decisions that we make. You'll see, I'll give you all of this. It shapes physiologically, how well we heal, and how well we feel. It shapes our well-being, okay? So mind-body environment is the operative principle here. I'm gonna skip this because it's a little technical. So what do I mean when I say that cognition is embodied? And by cognition, I mean cognition, perception, everything, okay? I said it started from cognitive linguistics. I'll give you two very simple examples. Let's say I feel at home here. Okay, well, you know that's a metaphor, right? And you know it's a metaphor that says this space makes me feel comfortable and safe, okay? That's easy. But think about this. Let's take another relationship. Let's say I say to you, I'm in a relationship. Okay, that doesn't sound like a metaphor, but it is. Because the fact of the matter is, why do I use the preposition in a relationship? Why don't I say I'm on a relationship or under a relationship or around why in? Because we conceptualize relationships as containers, as physical containers, and you're either in the relationship, you're breaking out of the relationship, or you're out of a relationship, right? So much of our understanding of the world is based on the very fact that we experienced it in bodies moving around. Okay, so let's take gravity. On your screen is CCTV in Beijing by Rem Koolhaas. You can look at this from afar in the slide on your left, and you can say, wow, that's really kind of cool. I mean, here's a building with a double cantilever, if you're an architect. That's the kind of thing architects get excited about. And it looks like a little scary, right? But because you personally are not threatened, you think that's cool. It's kind of like the same feeling you get if you watch a horror movie. Like, you know you're safe, so all those people doing those scary things to each other on the screen, it's titillating, but it's not like threatening, okay? But then if you go and you walk underneath that cantilever, you have what's called a schema to understand this part of your environment. A schema is a set of associations that you have built up through time. It's like literally neural pathways being bound together in which you know gravity goes down and pulls things to the earth, and heavy things fall unless they're supported, right? And you look at yourself under that and you think, whoa, maybe I should get out from underneath there. It's really a very unsettling experience. The other thing about it is that it's a physiological experience. You can't help but feel that way because you're wired to, because you've developed schemas, because maybe a book fell on you when you were crawling across the floor as a kid. Do people understanding me? Okay. So what we have is lots and lots of schemas derived from the built environment that help us comprehend new environments that we experience. Whoops, wait a minute. Sorry. Okay, so how does this work, and why am I telling you all of this anyway? Well, because there's some really interesting things about the way that people experience their environments that you wouldn't necessarily expect. And here I'm using the example of an experiment that used clipboards. A clipboard is obviously an environmental stimuli, even though it's not a building, right? But this could be an analogy for thinking about the built environment as well. A Yale psychologist took a bunch of students, study participants, gave them 10 resumes each and said, you're a human resources department personnel person, and you have 10 resumes to evaluate. Go off and do it and tell me who's the best one for the job. Okay, so everybody went away. They evaluated, they scored, so on. They came back. What he hadn't told everybody was that half of the resumes were put on clipboards. Ooh, I guess I can't go there. Were put on clipboards that were really, really heavy. And the other half of the resumes were put on clipboards that were like really flimsy and light. So maybe you can see where I'm going with this. The study participants who had the resumes with the heavy clipboards rated the job candidates as more substantial and more competent for the job, okay? That's an environmental stimulus that you have no idea is influencing you, that substantively changes your understanding of the environment. Okay, more examples. These are really fun. There are hundreds of examples. I won't give you hundreds, but I'll give you a few. Okay, so I said metaphors, like heavy clipboard, you know, like he's a heavy guy, like Trump, he's a big guy. Okay. Metaphorical and associative schemas can be very surprising, like the clipboard experiment, and they can seem really illogical. So, for example, if students take tests of IQ in rooms with low ceilings, they'll score less high than if they take tests in rooms with high ceilings. IQ. If students take tests in rooms with high ceilings where the ceilings are painted sky blue, they'll score higher on tests of creativity. Okay, so this is a profoundly different way of thinking about, one, how important the environment is in learning and human experience, and two, on what we should be thinking about within the design of the built environment. Okay, another one, actually I'm gonna skip that one too, because I can see that I'm going slower than I expected to. So among the things that embody cognition, what this is called is embodied cognition. Some people call it situated cognition, inactive cognition, I mean academics, you know. Just call it embodied cognition, it's the easy one to understand. One of the things, so how do people, for example, a pretty basic question, if you're interested in the kinds of things I'm interested in, is how do people understand space? And you think, well, you know, like you look at a map, and that point A is here, and point B is here, point C is here, and so on and so forth. Yes, but not only is the answer. So by flipping ourselves up and looking at this room as having 2 points of points there and having certain dimensions and certain proportions and so on, what that is called is allocentric perception. In other words, sort of bird's eye centric perception. But we don't only use that in our understanding of space, kind of obviously. We also use what's called egocentric perception. In other words, measuring from our body out. Okay, so we have two ways of understanding space, allocentric and egocentric. Now the interesting thing about egocentric is, if you look at me, I have like a small head, and you know, my head is, 1/9 proportion of the rest of my body, and so on and so forth. It's sort of stuff we all know about how human bodies look to one another. Okay, but that's not how we experience the environments from the inside, because we have much more sensory experience in certain parts of our body than we do in other parts of our body. And in fact, we have many more nerve endings in certain parts of our body and sensory receptors in our eyes, for example, than in other places. And so I'll just tell you something that's really cool, which is that there's a place right here, which is called the somatosensory cortex, which is where our motor cortex and our sensory cortices combine. And on that place in our brain, we actually have a topographical map that shows how much real estate is allocated in our brain to different parts of our body in terms of our understanding of things. And that topographical map looks like these guys. They're called homunculi. Okay, and there are two different ones. One is the sensory homunculi, which is on your left, and then there's the motor homunculi, which is on your which is on your right. So one of the first things, besides the tongue, which is like positively frightening, right? One of the things that first things you notice when you look at the homunculi that comes out is the hands. Okay. The hands are so important. So what does that mean for designers of educational environments or anything else? What it means is that it turns out that perception, okay, there's an old model of perception which all of you probably learned at some point, which is that you have sensory neurons and they receive information and then they kind of process it, and you go up through experience and so on. And then you make a decision about how to act, and then that uses your motor system. Right? Does that sound familiar? Okay. Your sensory system and your motor system are working in tandem all the time. Or as one cognitive neuroscientist put it, perception is perception for action. We are unbelievably goal-oriented. We are always looking and processing and trying to develop goals and then revise them, regenerate them, and so on and so forth. So, for example, you look at that surface on your right, which is a concrete surface, although the central panel is wood, and then below, obviously, is glass. And it's not just that you kind of look at it as an object. You imagine touching it. You imagine running your fingers across it. You can't help it. You have a motorically and sensorily engaged relationship to your environment all the time. Okay, now, I'll get to this a little bit later, but why is this important? One of the reasons it's important is because you want your students to identify and feel at home and feel like a place is theirs, right? I assume. Part of the community, as you guys so elegantly said. You're going to do that better if you design according to the way that people actually appropriate designs, which means to pay attention to the multi-sensory nature of the way that kids, everybody experiences environment. And just another thing along these lines, how many people know what mirror neurons are? Okay. So these were discovered about 12 years ago now. And basically, there's a scientist in Italy who is working with monkeys that have brains very much like humans. And he was looking at what neurons fired in what situations. And what he discovered was this, that you put two monkeys with each other, and one monkey smiles, and the neurons, the motor neurons in the brain of the other monkey that are associated with smiling fire. And it happens with humans too. So I look at you over there and I smile, and without even knowing it, your motor neurons are firing that were the same neurons that would fire when you smile. Okay, so in the very beginning of my research, I read that. I thought, wow, that's amazing, like another environmental stimulus, right? But that's social. I thought, what about buildings? Like, what about if I look at that door over there? Do I imagine myself walking out the door? Or whatever, since perception is perception for action? The answer is yes. They're called canonical neurons, and when you look at different parts of your built environment, you imagine yourself engaging in them in a way that revs up your motor system. Okay. So effectively what I'm saying, this is a wonderful playground in Norway. You know, you can't help it. You look at those balls and you feel a little bouncy, right? And you look at that bicycle coming up and you imagine the trajectory, because the eye has something called trajectory completion. What the built environment is a series of what psychologists call primes. You're constantly being primed to do this, to think this way, to associate this way, and so on and so forth. Primes and affordances. Another way to talk about this is to say the built environment, a classroom, a learning environment, offers affordances. It's not an inert environment, and it's certainly not an unimportant environment. It shapes the opportunities that people can have for how you use it and for how you feel about it as well, using color and so on. Okay, so we did psychology, and then we did first social life. The built environment shapes how our social interactions in a very profound way. We did individual life, feelings, thoughts, social relations, and so on. What about physiologically? This is probably best known, but environments shape the way that we heal and our health and our well-being in super profound ways. And this is beginning to become recognized in medicine and healthcare environments in particular, and in public policy. One of the things that I'm sort of riding hard. Okay, so you say physiologically, like what does that mean really? You know, I start with the metaphor, by the way, of like most people think of the built environment as kind of like a stage. Like I'm living my life, I'm thinking about you, I'm hoping that you're not getting bored, you're getting bored or not getting bored, and you're, whatever. And the built environment seems sort of a little bit irrelevant. It's like the stage on which all of this is happening, but it's not. It's shaping how all those things are happening. So this body of knowledge started about 30 years ago with a study by a guy who actually ended up founding this field because he went in for gallbladder surgery, but anyway. So he took a group of patients who needed gallbladder surgery, controlled for smoking, weight, health, general health, so on and so forth. And they were all in one hospital, operated on by the same doctor, same care staff for their recovery. All right, so they had this procedure, and then they went into the hospital. And there was a double-loaded corridor for recovery rooms. And one set of recovery rooms looked out on a brick wall. And the other set of recovery rooms looked out on a pastoral view. That's the upper right-hand image, okay? And he just watched them. He tracked their requests for pain medication and watched how quickly they recovered. After 3 days, he discovered that the people who were, everything else was the same. The people who were in rooms that looked out on a pastoral view had 35% fewer requests for pain medication and were released from the hospital a full day earlier. Okay, they healed better. That's pretty astonishing. And this has begun, and then now there have been all sorts of follow-up studies about the impact of nature on healing, on stress levels, on heart rates, and so on and so forth, in a way that really is affecting, this is a hospital in Singapore that was built quite recently, using the name of this field is biophilia, sort of the impact of nature, and we can talk about that later, on people's healing and sense of well-being. It also has a huge impact on children's focus. Okay, so views of nature we now know improve mood, improve cognitive focus, improve attentional capacities, ameliorate anxiety, settle heart rates, settle cortisol levels. Okay, just by having some nature. Even, of course, having access to nature is best, but even just views. Okay, now architects often say, well, okay, this is very interesting, Sarah, but you know, I'm a designer. Like, I'm not designing nature, I'm designing a building. So, and one of the things that I'm trying to do, I'm not going to go through all of this, is to try to extract out what kinds of design principles can we use, can we make a really great argument to clients, to school boards, to whomever, to school facilities people, that this is important because it will have an impact on how well the kids learn. This is important because it will have an impact on how well they behave themselves, and so on and so forth. That design is that important, is clear. There's a study in the UK in which they followed 751 pupils over the course of 2 years in 34 different classrooms, controlled for socioeconomic class, curriculum, so on and so forth, right? And they scored the classrooms on 6 different design elements: color, choice, flexibility, light, connectivity, and complexity, which is a very important one, actually. So on your left is a school that maybe many of you recognize, as maybe it looks even a little bit like your high school. On your right is a school by Kieran Timberlake in Washington, D.C. that is much more nuanced in its design and less stereotypical, okay? All right, so in this study, after 2 years, these 751 pupils, the students who were in the worst designed classroom were a full year behind the students in the best designed classroom academically. Okay, they'd learned that much more. Okay, now you're saying, like, it's got to be the teacher, it's got to be this. Yes, okay, it could be some of those things, but this was a very carefully done study, and it points to design elements: color, choice, flexibility, natural light, connectivity, and so on. Okay, so here are just some design principles that I am focusing on. One of them is, you know, often when people say, oh, I'm an architect, or I'm going to design a building, or whatever, you think of the overall form of the building as the thing that's most important, like what's it going to look like, okay, from the street, and so on. It seems that that is just about, it's much less important, the form of the building, than a lot of other things, okay? The form of the building is important for place attachment, like if it fits into the community and so on, for identification, for imageability and placemaking, that kind of thing. For wayfinding, if it stands out. This, by the way, is an elementary school. It's a one-room school in South Africa, in the townships. And the reason I like to show it again is because, like, talk about small design moves. This building was designed with a negative budget. Basically, it's all salvaged materials. And you can see what the surrounding homes look like. And Kevin, the guy who designed it, who's a buddy of mine, basically thought, you know, I'm not going to change the form of what I'm putting up very much because I want it to be familiar to them. But what I am going to do is change the surfaces and the design principles that I'm using. Okay, because one thing I know for sure, and one thing I can tell you, I mean, not just from my experience, but over, children hate to be bored, right? They hate it. I've got two. They hate to be bored, okay? So we've just learned, like we're constantly sort of grabbing on visually, mentally simulating our engagement with different kinds of environments. And it's also the more we have grabbed onto and can do mental simulations and engage, the more connected we're going to feel to that building. And so what you want is you want surfaces that promote that kind of engagement. So he spent a week driving around different restaurants in Cape Town and collecting recycled wine bottles. Of course, you couldn't do this in the States, but anyway, and he made this bottle wall, which ends up also being the hanger, the hooks for kids' knapsacks, and transforms light in this beautiful way. And then on the other wall, basically all he's done is take wood slats and put one slat flat and flush, another slat projecting, one slat flat, another slat projecting. But what do you do when you see that space, see that wall? You imagine touching it, right? You get involved in it. And that makes you like it. So you want people to have positive associations with the places that they're spending hours and hours every day. Okay. Another thing that I've learned from this research is that good details provoke the kind of mental simulation that I was talking about earlier. So do you see the skateboards there, which he used as runners for the sliding doors? Okay, so that's another thing, sort of, this is a construction detail. He used those wheels because it was cheap, right? And they had recycled skateboards. But because of that, you think, oh, you know, this is part of my daily life, and then it becomes part of the building. So again, you're promoting place attachment and place identity with this. Scale is critical. That's why I hesitated a little bit when I talked about the exterior, because the exterior can't just be a blank nothing, because people hate it when they're walking around in spaces that are not scaled to their bodies. People love patterns, different kinds of patterns. I'll talk about that later. These are the kinds of things that you can use to build character in school buildings. Natural light, critically important, supports circadian rhythms, which we all know and is becoming, people are becoming aware of more and more important than we ever understood before. But there are other things that using natural light does. It's hard. I mean, I know it's hard to get natural light. You're building a 4-story building. Like, well, how are you going to do that, right? My message to you is it's worth trying. It's worth trying to figure out how you can drop in light wells, how, you know, whatever, skylights, stacking the building in a slightly different way. Why? Because not only does it promote circadian rhythms, part of the reason we like natural light so much is because it keeps us connected to the outdoors. That's why, I'm sorry, I just thought it, I'm going to say it. That's why we hate spaces like this. Okay. It's like, what time of day is it? What's the weather like out? Where are the birds, right? You want, even if you're inside and you're in a classroom, you want to know that you're connected to the outside world. Okay, so that's another reason why natural light is important over and above circadian rhythms. The third reason, and this is really critical too, remember I said students hate to be bored, right? Natural light changes things. It changes all day long. So again, your perceptions of these things are they're subterranean. You don't realize how much you're responding to this kind of thing, but you are. I mean, just the fact that there's a pool of light over there and there wasn't when you got in and put down your lunchbox, it means something. We're humans. We live in habitats, and we need things from these habitats. Okay, I talked about pattern before. I just want to explain that a little better. This is, again, something that comes from environmental psychology. This, by the way, is, you know, I couldn't resist showing you some of this stuff, even though they weren't schools. This is the Scottish National Parliament. Such an amazing place. And there's so many interesting things to say about this space. But okay, stick to the topic, pattern complexity. We like things that are complex, but we like things that are complex if we can discern an overall pattern to them. In fact, we know that people who look at surfaces that have pattern complexity of a moderate level call them beautiful. Where they don't, if they have less complex surfaces or too complex surfaces that they can't be read. So a moderate level of pattern complexity is essential in order to help people feel calm and stimulated at the same time. Okay? And beauty, I mean, this is a word that when I was teaching in architecture schools, it was like a bad word. You can't talk about something being beautiful, you know, because beauty is so personal. Well, a lot of beauty is personal. I would admit it. Everybody else would too. But we know things, we know certain properties of things that people think are beautiful. So look at the 4 images that you see on the Beautiful Nature Needs to Pro-Sociality screen. So psychologists showed pictures, coupled pictures, top and bottom, to various people, or maybe it's left, right, and said, what do you think's more beautiful? Okay? You can guess. Everybody thought the slides on the top were much more beautiful than the slides on the bottom. Why? They're more manicured. There's more species diversity. There's more diversity of views. There are places where you can imagine prospect and refuge. So guess what? All right, so beauty. We can talk about beauty. There's beautiful nature, and then there's nature that's nice, but maybe not as beautiful, right? But what they found, what the researchers in the study found, is that if these people were looking at the beautiful spaces, their behavior was more pro-social. They were more generous. They were more cooperative with one another. They were more empathetic. Beauty promotes pro-social behavior. Now, this is beautiful nature, but again, there's like a whole research agenda that's associated with this that we need to start working on. Like, that's got to be true for the built environment too, right? We just need to start figuring it out. And what we also know is that poor design leads to poor outcomes. So another friend of mine, who's a cognitive neuroscientist, wired people up with some EEG, some wearable EEG, some things, and took heart rate and so on and so forth, and walked them down the street on the left, a Whole Foods market in New York City. And then he had them turn left and go into a little area, which is on the east side, where there were stoops and much smaller scale buildings, lots more variability, lots more projections and recessions, and so on and so forth. Guess what? Stress levels in the bad design, when they were walking along the bad design facade, were off the charts. compared to their stress levels when they were walking on the little neighborhood site, okay? Bad design hurts us, okay? We don't like to be bored. We don't like scaleless spaces. It's actually physiologically bad for us. And the conclusion to be drawn from that is that we really have to completely reconceptualize the value that society places on architecture, full stop. Because now, up until now, we have been thinking, well, you know, there's high architecture or fancy architectures, or Scott keeps telling me, you know, his clients sometimes say to him, don't build me a Taj Mahal. You know, there's high architecture, and then there's building. And schools, well, really, what are they? They're really sort of more building. You want to make them nicer, but, you know, they're coming out of a public budget, and so on and so forth. No, wrong, wrong. It's all architecture. It all has an impact on you physiologically, emotionally, psychologically, so on as cognitively, and so on and so forth, on your performance and so on. There is no such thing as a neutral building. So if we look at the Center for Disease Control's social determinants of health, they basically say the built environment is what, like 10% or something like that of the health, the things that shape human health. Okay, this is a big transformation from previous generations with thought that the genetically determined health was much more of a factor than in fact it is. We now know that genes are probably about 5% of what determine your overall health over the course of your lifetime. The rest of it is environmental, okay? And it's not just built environment, because if you look at the other factors in this Center for Disease Control diagram, you have the natural environment. Well, how many natural environments at this point are human-made, basically, right? So they're built environments too. You have the natural environment, at least some of it. You have the built environment activities. Well, what did we learn about action settings? Okay, the activities are shaped by the spaces you make. Community and a sense of community. Well, what about placement attachment and the things that I was saying about building community facilities that people can feel really affected, lifestyle, and so on and so forth. Estimates are that the built environment has affects about 40 to 80% of our health. That's a message that public health people need to hear. Okay, and then in terms of future research, some of this is coming into the public eye. There are various organizations like the Well Building Challenge, Well Building Institute, LEAD, et cetera, who are promoting some of this, especially fresh air, fresh water, clean sites, light, good light, thermal environment, and so on and so forth. My message to you today is that's a start, but it's no more than a start. And the reason, because they're basically focusing on things that are very easy to measure, like lumens levels. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. Okay, but I think I've made it pretty clear that there are all sorts of design factors that we need to take into account. It's complicated, but it's doable, and start studying and working with. And if we do, we'll have better schools for our children, and they'll thrive better, and so on. So my last message is, if I hadn't beaten it over the head enough, design is not a luxury. Design is a public good. And it's the kind of public good, it's the kind of art that everyone deserves to have. Thank you.